Pierre Nkurunziza, born December 18, 1963, Bujumbura, Burundi, died June 8, 2020, Karuzi, Burundian educator and former leader of a Hutu rebel group. He became president of Burundi in 2005, a position that he held until his death in 2020. Nkurunziza was raised in the province of Ngozi in northern Burundi, the son of a Tutsi mother and a Hutu father. His father had served as governor of two provinces before being killed in 1972 during a wave of ethnic violence that resulted in the deaths of more than 100,000 Hutus and more than 10,000 Tutsis. Nkurunziza graduated from the University of Burundi in Bujumbura in 1990 with a degree in physical education. He went on to teach high school and also served as an assistant lecturer at the university. In 1993, civil war erupted between Hutu rebel groups and the Tutsi-dominated army. Nkurunziza narrowly avoided death during a 1995 army attack on the university campus that killed some 200 people. After his escape, Nkurunziza became active in the conflict, joining the Forces for the Defense of Democracy, Forces pour la Défense de Démocratie, FDD, which was the armed wing of a Hutu exile group, the National Council for the Defense of Democracy, Conseil National pour la Défense de Démocratie, CNDD. In 1998, a Burundian court sentenced him in absentia to death for his rebel activities. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, the CNDD-FDD split into several factions, with Nkurunziza assuming chairmanship of one faction in 2001. In that capacity, Nkurunziza headed negotiations that culminated in his faction of the CNDD-FDD signing a peace accord with Pres. Domitien Ndayizeye in 2003. As part of the agreement, Nkurunziza received immunity from prosecution for war crimes. He later joined Ndayizeye's cabinet as Minister of Good Governance in November 2004. The CNDD-FDD became an official political party in 2005. Under Nkurunziza's leadership, the party won a decisive victory in parliamentary elections held in July. In preparation for the upcoming presidential election in parliament, Nkurunziza was asked to be the CNDD-FDD's candidate. He accepted the nomination and resigned as party chairman. In the ensuing vote by members of parliament, Nkurunziza, the only candidate, won 151 of the 162 ballots cast and was elected president on August 19, 2005. He was formally sworn into office on August 25. Presidency. Nkurunziza faced the daunting challenge of maintaining peace and stability in the war-ravaged country. In part to allay fears among many Tutsi of Hutu-dominated rule, he actively recruited Tutsi members to the CNDD-FDD. His new cabinet, named less than a week after he took office, included 11 Hutu and 9 Tutsi, virtually all of whom were serving in government posts for the first time. 7 of the new ministers were women. Nkurunziza also made overtures to the National Liberation Forces, Forces Nationales de la Libération, FLN, the last Hutu rebel group remaining outside the peace process. His first attempt to renew the peace talks was rejected by the FLN in September 2005, but he brokered a tentative ceasefire with the group during talks held in Tanzania in 2006. The truce was soon ignored, however, and intermittent violence resumed. No substantive agreement was reached until May 2008, when the FLN convened with Nkurunziza in Bujumbura and signed another ceasefire. In December of that year, Nkurunziza met with FNL leader Agathon and signed a definitive peace agreement. In addition to negotiating the fraught political terrain, Nkurunziza was confronted by massive economic problems. Agricultural production, which makes up the majority of Burundi's exports, had dwindled. In the face of ever-shifting tides of violence, few people were able to remain sedentary long enough to harvest crops. Nkurunziza began recruiting foreign capital soon after his election, raising $2 billion to invest in agriculture. In November 2006, Nkurunziza successfully ushered Burundi into the East African Community Economic Bloc and in April 2007 aided in the reformation of the Economic Community of the Great Lakes countries, a trade organization including Burundi, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Rwanda. With the aid of World Bank funds, he also spearheaded infrastructure projects aimed at making water and electricity more accessible. These tentative movements toward progress were undercut by accusations from human rights groups that Nkurunziza's administration refused to acknowledge dissent and persecuted journalists critical of its policies. These concerns persisted in June 2010, as Nkurunziza was re-elected with more than 90% of the vote following the withdrawal of all 6 of his challengers. The campaign and election proceedings were marred by violence, contributing to a markedly low voter turnout. Nkurunziza continued to face criticism in his second term over his administration's treatment of the media and response to public dissent. He garnered additional condemnation for his desire to stand for a third term as president in the 2015 election, something which many, including some within his own party, saw as a violation of the country's constitution as well as the 2000 Arusha agreement that had paved the way to ending Burundi's civil war. Nkurunziza's supporters countered by claiming that the 2-term limit stipulated in both documents was not yet applicable because Nkurunziza had been directly elected only once to his second term and argued that his first term, by which he had been elected by parliament, did not count toward the term limit. Nkurunziza's plan to stand for president in the June 2015 election, confirmed in late April by the CNDD-FDD, led to many large-scale demonstrations with protesters calling for him to abandon his bid for a third term. The public protests often led to clashes with the police and harsh responses from the government, alarming many in Burundi as well as the international community. On May 13, 2015, Nkurunziza joined East African leaders in neighboring Tanzania to discuss the crisis. While he was out of the country, Maj. Gen. Godefroid Niyombare launched a coup. Within 2 days, however, the coup attempt had failed. Despite the domestic and international condemnation over Nkurunziza's plan to stand for a third term, he remained resolute in his decision. The dates of the presidential and parliamentary polls were repeatedly delayed, however, because of the ongoing violence within the country and criticism that the political climate was not conducive for elections, as well as international pressure to postpone the polls. Opposition groups, citing unfavorable conditions in the country, announced that they were boycotting the elections. Amid considerable unrest, Nkurunziza won a third term on July 21, 2015. Nkurunziza's third term was plagued with ongoing unrest and violence, particularly perpetrated by the authorities and the Imbonerakure, the youth wing of the CNDD-FDD. Although Burundi initiated a withdrawal from the International Criminal Court, ICC, in October 2016 and formally left the body a year later, the country still faced an ICC investigation into alleged crimes against humanity committed between April 2015 and October 2017. In March 2018, Nkurunziza was granted the title of Eternal Supreme Guide by the CNDD-FDD. Later that year, controversial amendments to the constitution were passed via referendum and then promulgated. Among the changes were some that affected the presidency: a change in term length from 5 to 7 years, with a limit of 2 consecutive terms. This raised fears that Nkurunziza would stand for president again and potentially extend his time in office for 2 more terms after the expiration of his current one in 2020. He denied intending to do so, however. His denial appeared to be bolstered when, in January 2020, the CNDD-FDD designated Evariste Ndayishimiye their candidate for the presidential election scheduled for later that year. Ndayishimiye was declared the winner of the May election. Nkurunziza was scheduled to step down from the presidency in August, but he died unexpectedly in June. Following a constitutional court ruling that President-elect Ndayishimiye should not wait to take office, he was inaugurated on June 18, 2020. Pierre Nkurunziza, who became president of Burundi at a hopeful time of reconciliation in 2005, after a bloody civil war, only to become an authoritarian leader whose 15-year reign was marked by repression, violence, and an attempted coup, died June 6 at a hospital in the country's Karuzi province. He was reported to be 55. The government's official statement described the cause of death as a heart attack, after he was taken ill recently. There was widespread speculation that he may have had COVID-19, the disease caused by the novel coronavirus, after his wife was airlifted to Nairobi in May to be treated for the disease. Mr. Nkurunziza, pronounced Nkurunziza, who said he believed he was divinely ordained to lead his country, became president at the end of the 12-year Burundian civil war. The prolonged dispute was largely a conflict between the country's two primary ethnic groups, the Hutus and Tutsis. The minority Tutsi population had long exercised political and military control in the small Central African country, which has a population of about 11 million people and was once under Belgian colonial rule. Mr. Nkurunziza, whose mother was a Tutsi, identified with his politically prominent father's group, the Hutus. His father had been killed during a wave of violence in 1972. Mr. Nkurunziza joined Hutu rebel forces in the 1990s and rose to a position of power in a group called, in shortened form, the Forces for the Defense of Democracy, better known by the abbreviation CNDD-FDD. The group became a political party and Mr. Nkurunziza's base of power. By the time the violence ended in Burundi, an estimated 250,000 people had been killed. The Hutus and Tutsis also battled for control of neighboring Rwanda in the 1990s, leaving about 800,000 people dead in that country. During the civil war, Mr. Nkurunziza was sentenced to death by the Tutsi-dominated judiciary, but he received a commutation as part of a general amnesty. As Burundi ratified a new constitution in 2005, Mr. Nkurunziza's CNDD-FDD party took control of both houses of the national parliament. Those bodies then elected Mr. Nkurunziza president. With his youth and dual ethnic heritage, he held promise as a leader who could heal the bitter divisions in his country. The bloodshed in the last 12 years is a lot and enough, Mr. Nkurunziza said when he first took office. We need to stop the war as soon as possible. We must fight against regional or ethnic divisions, combat poverty through improving health and education. During his first term as a president, he brought a measure of stability to Burundi, which is among the poorest countries in the world and was beset by malnutrition and widespread outbreaks of malaria and HIV/AIDS. More than 5,000 schools were built throughout the country, along with 10 sports stadiums. Mr. Nkurunziza was re-elected to a second 5-year term, by popular vote, in 2010, but as he tightened his hold on power, he was seen as increasingly erratic and authoritarian. A one-time soccer coach, he seldom traveled without his personal soccer team, which played local squads around the country. During his years as a rebel guerrilla fighter during the Civil War, he became a born-again evangelical Christian after a religious epiphany. He said he was ordained by Providence to be president and, in addition to the soccer team, traveled with a choir, which sang at prayer meetings in which the president washed the feet of his followers. Nkurunziza indeed believes he is president by divine will, his spokesman told Agence France Presse, and he therefore organizes his life and government around these values. Tensions flared throughout Burundi in 2015, when Mr. Nkurunziza decided to seek re-election as president, despite a constitutional limit of 2 terms. He said his first term, in which he was put in office by legislators, not a vote of the people, did not count. As violent protests broke out around the country, Mr. Nkurunziza was nearly overthrown in an attempted coup in May 2015. His security forces enforced a brutal crackdown on political dissidents and media that continued through the election, which gave Mr. Nkurunziza a 3rd term as president. When he was sworn in, he said his enemies would be scattered like flour thrown into the air, as the God of heaven is a witness. In 2015 and 2016, human rights observers from the United Nations counted nearly 500 summary executions in Burundi as well as dozens of disappearances. Mr. Nkurunziza later ordered the UN Human Rights Office to be closed and demanded that international aid organizations report the ethnic identities of Burundians working in their offices. An estimated 400,000 refugees fled across the border to Tanzania and other countries to escape the rising tide of violence. The brutality was denounced by President Barack Obama and other world leaders, who feared a return of Burundi's civil war. In the meantime, Mr. Nkurunziza banned the use of motorcycles in the then capital city of Bujumbura, suspecting they could be used to spark a revolt. The constitution was amended to allow Mr. Nkurunziza to stay in power until 2034, and the CNDD-FDD pronounced him the country's eternal supreme guide. In 2019, he announced, much to the surprise of many, that he would not seek re-election the next year. National elections were held last month, in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, with Mr. Nkurunziza's hand-picked successor, Evariste Ndayishimiye, succeeding him as president. Pierre Nkurunziza was born in Bujumbura on December 18, 1964. Some sources report that he was born a year earlier. He grew up in Burundi's Ngozi province, and in 1990, he received a bachelor's degree in sports education from the University of Burundi. He taught and coached at the university and the National Military Academy. In 1993, while he was teaching at the university, several hundred students were killed after a military coup in which Burundi's first Hutu president, Melchior Ndadaye, was assassinated. The experience led Mr. Nkurunziza to join the Hutu resistance. He was wounded several times during the civil war before a ceasefire agreement in 2003. Mr. Nkurunziza and his wife, Denise Bukamai, had 2 sons. Other survivors include a sister. In recent years, Burundi's military forces have reportedly been trained by Russian mercenaries, and Chinese groups built a multimillion-dollar presidential palace. When Mr. Nkurunziza stepped down as president last month, he was awarded a luxury villa and more than $500,000 by his country's government. Burundi's parliament voted that he permanently be anointed the country's supreme leader. Thank you for watching this video.